Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sandra and I live in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I'm writing to tell you and your listeners about a very extraordinary cryptid encounter that my grandfather told me growing up on our little Maholisburg farm in southern Africa. His extraordinary story leaves me to conclude that there rarely are strange creatures living in our midst that so few of us even know exist. This is a story that will horrify you and amaze you at the very same time, leaving you wondering what on earth these strange creatures actually were. All these years later, I am still clueless as to what these things were, but maybe one of your listeners out there may have the answer to this curious question. My grandfather was a very cantankerous old man who was very opinionated and was not afraid to express his conjecture about things. He was not the most likeable character because he was always grumpy, fractious, grouchy, peevish and cranky. But to be fair to him, he had done his part and served in the Second World War in the South African Navy and was nearly killed on a couple of occasions. One such example was when a stray bullet went flying through his hat, leaving behind a large gaping hole. But it didn't touch him, so that was a narrow, close shave, as you can imagine. Another time the ship he was supposed to be on was torpedoed, but he was luckily reassigned to another vessel at the very last minute. Once again, an amazing escape. He was one lucky man. The South Africans did establish an enviable reputation as sailors and naval airmen in all manner of ships during the Second World War, and earned a formidable reputation as some of the best sailors in the world. I grew up in South Africa, the land long revered for the Big Five, as people flocked to our country from all over the world to observe the glorious wildlife here, with the rhino and lion being the greatest source of fascination for our tourists. We had a case more recently in the Lion Park that's close to Johannesburg, when a Chinese man got out of his vehicle to take a snapshot of a lion and was mauled to death by the creature, while the bystanders in their cars looked on in utter horror, hardly daring to believe what was unfolding before their very eyes, and wondering what had induced this naive tourist to get out of his car in the first place, which was the last thing he should have done. I cannot imagine what his poor girlfriend was thinking as she witnessed her boyfriend losing his life to this formidable predator that should never be underestimated, because lions are powerful, majestic, magnificent, but exceedingly dangerous beasts. There is also a huge crocodile in Zimbabwe that has got to be the most Herculean-sized creature in the Zambezi River, and the locals look upon him in awe and reverence, because his claim to fame is that he's actually eaten 3 fishermen on the Zambezi. When I met him for the very first time, at a very large distance of course, I was amazed to find that this vast creature had somehow become quite a hero. To me he just looked like a grouchy, bad-tempered, hungry, monstrous crocodile, but to the locals he was a huge big deal. Here in South Africa we do possess some of the most phenomenal coastline to explore, with its huge high breakers and vast areas of soft white pearly beach sand that stretches back for literally miles. Let's not forget the whale sightings, seals and dolphins at certain times of the year that are a complete delight to behold, and must seem for some tourists visiting our country, because, put simply, these monsters of the deep are absolutely breathtaking. I grew up in Johannesburg, once considered the most treed city in the world, although sadly I believe that is no longer the case, as many of those trees have been removed. I attended a private school with my sister Rosa, but both of us could barely wait for the weekends which we would spend on our grandfather's farm. One day my grandfather told me this story in his very own words, and he swore to me that this story is 100% true, and I categorically believe him. So this is a story that he told me in his very own words. One day one of my farm workers, Simon, was riding his mountain bike down one of the bumpy dirt roads that was surrounded on either side with high rugged embankments and rocky crevices, as well as vast open areas of wild yellow grasses, thorny briars, pretty fields of wild colourful pink cosmos flowers, prickly pear succulents, and a scattering of indigenous trees. It was a beautiful sunny morning, with the bright shafts of sunlight spreading their golden warm rays over the escarpment. Suddenly the worker heard this very peculiar raucous commotion, which he described as the most ungodly sound that he had ever heard in his entire life. He said it was like a low guttural hissing and growling, and the sound of major caterwauling, as if two formidable apex predators were engaging in a huge fight. Simon, my farm worker, sensed that the whole area, although warm and sunny and bright, became cloaked with a thick veil of heaviness that was insidious, pernicious, menacing, and unlike anything he'd ever felt before. If it were at all possible, it was as if the prolific, cheerful bird song had all but dissipated, and the only thing that could be heard across the valley was this god-awful, out-of-worldly sound that had more synchronicity to the gates of hell than to our reality. The worker told my grandfather that he was shaking so much and experiencing such violent heart palpitations to such an extent he had to get off his bike, which he placed upright against the hilly embankment. Even though he was filled with a feeling of impending dread, and he was frightened by that terrible noise that was far more formidable than a lion's roar, he said that an insatiable, overwhelming curiosity overcame him, and he just had to investigate what this strange creature actually was, or what they actually were. He was certain that anyone else, on hearing such a huge commotion and sensing such an evil malaise, would have literally hightailed it out of there a long time ago and as fast as they could. But he was not just anybody else. He came from a powerful Zulu heritage, a line of brave, heroic warriors, some who had single-handedly killed a lion in previous generations. He was not going to bring shame upon his family line by failing to remain strong in perilous, dangerous situations. That would not be acceptable. I knew if I just ran away that I'd always be left wondering what this thing actually was, or they were, and it would haunt me for the rest of my life, and I would be kicking myself afterwards for not having the guts or the courage to investigate, he told me. Besides, being Zulu, I cannot just run away, because that would make me a coward. My father had always taught me growing up that a Zulu man should always face his fears and be courageous, because that is what is expected of a man. I was shaking, trembling, and breathing heavily. I could still feel my heart thumping in my chest. I ventured towards the noise and tried to make myself as inconspicuous as I possibly could by taking cover through a thorny hedge of briars that was sparse enough for me to get a clear view of these creatures, even if it did mean getting a little torn up myself, but that was a very small price to pay. Then I saw them, and nothing in this world prepared me for what I was witnessing. These creatures should not have existed in our reality, because they easily belonged to the days when dinosaurs roamed the earth. They were engaged in an immense brawl, and quite literally fighting to the death. Of that I was certain. The energy they exhibited between each other was one of intense hatred and abhorrent hostility. These hideously vile-looking creatures were colossal, easily 10 feet tall, 1,200 pounds, and 6 foot wide. But the most disturbing thing was that they were distinctly human-like. It was like they were half human and half lizard, or even Komodo dragon, if you like. Without a shadow of a doubt, they were grotesquely evil, and emitted a very sulphurous odour that smelled like death and decay. They were covered from head to toe with very rough-looking scaly skin, and they stood up on long bow legs that were thick, powerful, and dense with muscle, and they had very strong, thick, powerful tails. I noticed that they were 3 creatures, 2 that were fighting and tearing each other apart, while one was sitting back watching the show quite happily, seemingly unfazed by the whole affair, without an ounce of compassion or concern on its face. It really didn't care what the outcome of this fight would be. It was of no concern to this creature. I concluded in that brief second that it was 2 males fighting over a female, and whoever victoriously won the deadly assault would become the female suitor. Well, that was my distinct impression. I'm not saying I'm right, but that's what I thought. These creatures were the ugliest, most grotesque things I've ever seen in my entire life, and all of them had unique, individual, different markings on their skins. One was dotted in yellows and browns and reds, while the largest one had distinct black and green markings, while the female was much plainer and was virtually a mottled brown, ugly colour. The skins were like the patterns you will see on snakes. The heads on these creatures were utterly humongous, but flat with a long rounded snout, with the hugest mouth which opened up to reveal very sharp, deadly, treacherous-looking, jagged incisors. They also possessed human-like hands and feet, with jagged, sharp claws for nails that would easily lacerate your flesh in seconds. The wanton eyes on these creatures were deep brown and appeared insidiously evil and demoniacal. I watched these pernicious creatures tearing, slashing, and ripping each other apart, and lashing into each other's flesh with their sharp talons, all the while hissing, snarling, and growling. The slightly larger of the 2 reptilian-like humanoids had the upper hand, as he was infinitely larger and more powerful, using his physical advantages, however slight, to his optimum leverage. I watched him pounding the other humanoid and holding him down with a hefty brute force, where he proceeded to bite out chunks of the creature's flesh, devouring them up in huge, gluttonous mouthfuls, all the while resuming his unceasing attack. His hideous foe was quite literally being eaten alive, while he weakly fought back with all his might that was left within him, until finally, in an exhausted act of surrender, he succumbed to his fatal wounds, and finally died. Then the most extraordinary thing happened. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The victor directed the female humanoid lizard to the dead corpse, and then she began to devour it hungrily, as meaty crumbs of the creature messily splattered over the grass. The male waited patiently until she had eaten her fill, and then proceeded to finish off all the remains until everything had been devoured. I'd never in my life seen such a savage depravity before. But what were these creatures, I wondered? Were they left-over dinosaurs from a bygone time? I could not be certain about that. The large, repugnant male proceeded to sniff the air, and I noticed his forked tongue seemed to be sensing something in the environment, as if he was detecting an interesting, curious smell that he could not fathom and was not well acquainted with. But whatever the smell was, it was of great interest and curiosity to him. I wondered what it was that he was smelling, and then suddenly, to my horrified realization, it suddenly dawned on me that he'd obviously got a whiff of me, and it was me that he was smelling. I had no idea what to do, because I was so incapacitated by the petrifying, alarming realization that this thing could come after me, literally kill me, devour me, but worst of all, eat me alive. That was my biggest fear. I was left with 2 choices. One was to get back on my bike and ride back to the farm as fast as I possibly could, or the other was just to stay very still and hope the creature just lost interest in me and went away. I decided to remain very still and hope that the creature would lose interest in my smell. But lose interest in me he most certainly did not, and to my horror this foul, malevolent creature began to forage around in the bushes and undergrowth, looking for the source of the smell. Before I knew it, he was there, eyeing me down with the most wicked, treacherous, diabolical brown eyes that I have ever seen. For a second he was very still, and just stood there glaring at me through his predatory eyes that were devoid of any humanity whatsoever. It truly felt like this creature wanted my very soul. I let out a shrill scream as the creature pounced upon me and bit into my arm. and the pain was excruciating and shooting through my body like violent fireworks, erupting in agonizing explosive spasms. I fainted in shock and terror, becoming momentarily unconscious, which may well have been my saving grace. The male humanoid carried my seemingly motionless body over to the female. I think he thought I was dead. He placed me on the ground before her, and presented me as another trophy for the female to banquet and feast upon. Possibly he thought he would score more points with her as a potential suitor, and as he placed me down before her, I sensed his ego was very inflated by pride, and it was as if he was saying, "Look what I got for you, another tasty meal. Am I not worthy of your attentions?" I'm glad to say that it would seem that the female's appetite had all but receded, and she had very little interest in eating me at all. I think she was simply not hungry, and she eyed me with a very little interest, as if her powerful suitor had presented her with an offensive, pathetic offering. She let out a disgusting, disapproving grunt to express her complete displeasure, and proceeded to totter away on her long, thick bow legs. The male looked glum and very disappointed by her disinterest in his prized trophy. All this time I played dead, because I figured if they thought I was dead, they would falsely believe that they could dine on me later, and when they were distracted, that would be my opportunity to slip away. Well, that was the plan that was unravelling in my head anyway. The large male suddenly threw me over his massive shoulders like a sack of potatoes, carrying me into an underground cave system that I didn't even know existed in this part of Maholisburg. I was being carried through a jumbo-sized maze of underground tunnels that twisted, spiraled, and curled like a large freeway system of some kind. The inner structures of these seemingly endless long underground tunnels were solid, strong, and tall, made up of bright red dirt and heavy boulders caked together to create powerful foundations. To my horror, there were dozens of these hideous creatures bustling around, and the place was a hive of activity, giving me the impression of a very busy city. There were quite literally colonies of these strange humanoids, and they appeared organised, intelligent, and seemed to have a very distinguished, orderly, and structured hierarchy system among them. Well, that's what the fleeting impression was that I got of this underground labyrinth, but it reeked to high heaven, smelling exactly like rotten flesh. The big creature threw me down in front of this large brown reptilian humanoid that towered above him. I think it may have been his mother or some kind of other female of prominence in their society, maybe even a queen of some kind, who knows? I noticed all the females appeared to be a very dull, ugly brown colour, while the males were speckled like colourful snakes with varying mottled patterns and colours on their reptilian scaly skins. The female was hideously ugly but titanic in size and girth, and about 13 feet tall, but when she saw me lying before her as a rather scrawny offering, she bristled and erupted in an indignant furor. I could tell that she was incandescent with rage. She made a furious cacophony of noises, and finally she grunted in displeasure, clearly appalled and offended by the very sight of me, and her nostrils flared in disgust as she smelt me. When she looked at the reptilian that had presented me before her as some kind of a gift, she oscillated her claw-like hands towards him indignantly to express her complete revulsion. Even I was shocked to find that these creatures found me to be repulsive and piteous. Suddenly a speckled yellow and white reptilian creature came scuttling forward, and listening to the grunting female's moans, he obediently upon her orders slung me over his shoulders and took me away from her fast. Finally I found myself being carried out of the cool darkness of the cave into the bright, startling light of the sun, which was so dramatic in its contrast that my eyes began to water. Before I knew it, the creature tossed me on the ground like I was a heap of revolting, disgusting rubbish that he wanted to discard. I luckily fell onto a large, soft, grassy verge, where my fall was softened by the cushioning of the thick undergrowth. For a while I stood there, unable to believe what had transpired, and it amazed me to see that I was still actually alive. But the wound on my arm was a painful reminder that I needed immediate medical attention. It was still bleeding profusely, but I could tell a deep-seated infection was coursing its way through my tissues very fast indeed, and my life literally hung in the balance. I managed to walk back to the farm, as taking the bike was no longer a viable option, as the escalating pain surfing through my body was so immensely traumatic. But despite all this, I did manage to hobble back to the farm, which was the most arduous journey of a lifetime, as every second caused excruciating anguish for my poor, bedraggled, pained body. And so it was my grandfather told me this amazing, extraordinary story. His farm worker had to have his arm amputated to prevent the terrible infection from shutting down his entire body. The bite from this creature had caused a flesh-eating disease called necrotizing fasciitis, which means that all the dead tissue had to be removed, and the surgeon at the time believed the safest course of action was a full amputation of his entire arm. My grandfather knew that Simon was a reliable, honest, and dependable person who was not given to making up stories, and so he went to investigate the area for himself, opposite to where his bike was still standing, propped up against the embankment. He wanted to see if he could see any physical evidence of the fight that these creatures engaged in. He did not find the underground cave system, but there was a great deal of high rocky elevation in the area, so the entrance of the cave could have been well hidden secretly by those creatures. He did discover pieces of scaly flesh connected to tissue lying scattered on the ground that was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Simon, my grandfather's loyal and devoted farm worker, did live for another 20 years after his harrowing ordeal with these scale-like humanoids, but he was not the same man after that accident, because he continually suffered the huge effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. My grandfather believed he would never be able to come to terms with his encounter with those heinous creatures. As for my grandfather, he must have died well over 45 years ago by now. I never forgot the story he told me, which I thought might be of interest to your listeners. On the subject of Bigfoot, I don't know actually of any counters here in Africa of the mythical beast, but I suppose anything is possible when it comes to the hairy man. Maybe he is around and people have had encounters and are not talking. That could be possible. I know that both Simon and my grandfather never shared their stories of the strange reptilians for the fear of ridicule and disbelief, which is also the case with Bigfoot encounters. I think if people did see Bigfoot out here in South Africa, they would not be keen to share their story with anyone. So maybe there are people sitting on their secrets like a hen on her eggs. Who knows? It's very plausible. I hope you enjoyed my story. All I want to say is that all of us know what it's like. I don't know how many of you have searched for Bigfoot and tried to find him. Well, tonight's story is all about that. We have a man who searches for Bigfoot, and when he's not looking, Bigfoot shows himself. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Trevor, and ever since of the age of 15, I was exposed to an incredible television program called Finding Bigfoot. I had a burning, insatiable desire and hunger to find this mysterious, hairy humanoid that I was so strangely drawn to. I was not on a mission to prove to the world that Bigfoot was real by any manner of means. On the contrary, I didn't care about that scientific stuff at all. I just wanted my own personal one-on-one encounter with a Bigfoot. I was so intrigued, mystified and curious about such an extraordinary being like this, living in our forests in North America. And if all these so-called personal sightings of Bigfoot were indeed true, and not spurious, then I wanted a taste of that apple pie for myself, even if I had to travel from one bakery to another, if you catch my drift, to find that perfect apple pie. In this case, of course, it would be from one area of natural forest to another, looking for a fleeting, remote chance of an encounter with the hairy humanoid. I had heard all kinds of Bigfoot stories, from horrifying accounts with the beast, where people would say that if they never saw this grotesque monster ever again, it would be way too soon. Then there were others who'd experienced benign encounters with the criature, sometimes feeling terrified, other times fascinated and even awe-inspired in a seemingly quick, ever so brief encounter, while there were others whom had been literally had their lives physically, emotionally and mentally changed and transformed by the hairy humanoid. It would seem that there were not only highly individualistic species of these Bigfoot-like creatures living in North America with varying hair colours and physical appearances, but creature with a wide array of seemingly human-like temperaments, from the kind and maternal to the ferocious, aggressive, volatile, and sometimes even deadly. I was so in awe of a creature that clearly had managed to escape the scrutiny of human beings for such a long time, and had managed successfully to remain hidden in the shadows, despite how much logging we've done in recent years. Granted, there are vast areas of unexplored American wilderness that have barely been touched by humans, apart from a fleeting visit from a lone hiker or adventure seeker from time to time. Of course, over many generations, there have been thousands of personal eyewitness encounters with these creatures. But despite all this, every single one of those incredible testimonies still remains fictitious until they can be scientifically proven. I was not worried by any of that stuff, of course, because in my gut, like so many of your awesome listeners, I knew that Bigfoot was real. I think knowing without seeing makes you a pretty special and unique person, because invariably you're in touch with your gut. One thing I've learnt about our natural instincts is that they don't lie, and they keep us alive and guide us to make the right choices in tough, life-threatening situations, like choosing to run from a wild animal or walking away slowly, and sometimes even playing dead. All these gut instincts, if listened to, can quite literally save our lives. I grew up in Seattle with 2 brothers and 1 sister. Both my parents are High Court judges, and my brother and sisters are both embarking on the same legal journeys. They're all incredibly academic, with sharp brains and very high IQs. Imagine my parents' surprise when I came along. You would have been forgiven for believing my mother had brought the wrong baby home from the hospital after I was born. I had very little academic prowess, and my fascination and interest was in the natural world. I'm much more interested in fishing, hiking, hunting and exploring than anything to do with academic studies. I came from a family where getting distinctions was as natural as breathing, whereas for me I was lucky if I passed a math assignment. Growing up, I absolutely hated and loathed school so very much. I remember I had my own techniques for handing in my belated homework. Yes, I did use that proverbial excuse that the dog ate my homework a few times, but when that excuse wore thin and the teacher asked me where my homework was from the previous day, I would say, "Miss, I handed it in, I know I did." Then I would proceed to look under my teacher's desk, and cunningly I would say, "Oh, here it is. You must have dropped it when you were gathering all the homework together," with a look of great surprise written on my face. Of course, I had just put the book there. I do remember this deceptive technique of mine worked every time without failing, giving me a full extra day to get an assignment done and finished. Although on a few occasions my teacher did explain that it was odd that it was always my homework that managed to drop and go missing, and not anybody else's in the whole class. What could she do, though? She couldn't prove a thing. As you can imagine, my parents found that my flagging grades was a huge embarrassment to them, and they could not relate to my struggle with academia. I think it had to be humbling for them to have a son that did not conform to their high academic standards, and maybe that's why I came into their lives in a funny way. Do not get me wrong, my parents loved me, but my passions and interests were so peculiar and odd to them. Imagine their immense horror when they began to realize that I had a deep and extraordinary fascination for the cryptid creature called Bigfoot. They were utterly horrified. I do remember hearing my mother discussing my fascination with Bigfoot and saying to my father, "He's not that bright, not like our other children. He believes everything he sees on television, as he seems intent on gullibly trusting that this spurious creature of fiction is actually real." I could hear my father say, "I don't want any son of mine filling his mind with such atrocious hogwash, especially when it's clearly not true. What nonsense they feed them these days on television." It's not hogwash to him, dear. Try and understand that. I know it's hard for us to relate to it, but you do need to understand that and accept it. Just let him be. He's not exploring the same legal paths as the rest of us, and we need to accept that he's different, and As erroneous as that may be to stomach, we just have to accept it. And so it was. My family did begin to accept my very strange, quirky peculiarities, which were not something they really enigmatically understood. As a young boy, I busied myself in all kinds of enterprising odd jobs, mowing lawns for people, planting seedlings, enamelling yard fences, and even painting houses, all to procure some well-needed pocket money for one intention only. I wanted nothing more in this entire world than embarking upon some exciting adventures to various places around North America, Alaska, and Canada, where Bigfoot sightings had indeed been recorded. I then designated to meet 2 other very interested boys my age, who were equally as desirous as I was to encounter a Bigfoot, but I was to unfortunately later to ascertain that they had much more nefarious motives about Bigfoot, but more about that a little later in my story. So armed with all my camping equipment, my own reliable car, a 2008 Honda Civic, a Ruger rifle, and everything I could possibly need, I literally travelled to all parts of America with these 2 other young men in order to find Bigfoot and to search for signs of this elusive, wonderful creature. I also met hundreds of people on my journey who had had curious, somewhat bizarre encounters with Bigfoots. Some were happy stories, others utterly terrifying. I did notice that many of these encounters happened when a person was all on their own, or it was an accidental chance encounter, but more often than not, and 9 times out of 10, these encounters always happened when they were never expected or anticipated. It never happened when they were looking for the creature. I promise you that I travelled all across America to the so-called ostensible Bigfoot hotspots, and I did battle the elements hugely, such as rain, snow, sleet, ice, and extremes of heat and cold. We literally roughed it and camped out in almost every weather condition, with one solo intention alone, and that was to find the mythical creature that we loved to call Bigfoot. We saw signs of him everywhere we went. Believe me, we encountered large footprints that we carefully measured and excitedly photographed in mud and sometimes even in snow. And believe me, these tracks were absolutely colossal. Our largest footprint measured 26 inches. Now that is jumbo-sized indeed. We came across trees that had been deliberately snapped, as well as hut-like structures resembling Indian tepees, layered on the ground made from large tree limbs that had been placed strategically on top of each other. We found Bigfoot nests that rarely stank of rotting flesh and stale urine. Sometimes we would even find food supplies on the ground, like walnuts and fresh fruit such as berries and paws, apples and wild pears. And we also came across piles and piles of clean bones, where every morsel had been cleaned to perfection. We would hang around, hoping to encounter the elusive creature, but they never returned to their nests while we were looking for them, even though we wore ghillie suits and lay low, making ourselves as inconspicuous as conceivably possible. What was extraordinary for me personally was that the more we searched for Bigfoot and found startling, compelling evidence, the less chance we seemed to actually encounter the creature, almost as if they knew our intentions and were deliberately lying low, staying only yards away from us probably, and laughing at us in the process. I wouldn't be at all surprised. We did have these moments when the woods became very quiet and subdued, and all the natural noises of the woods, like the pretty bird songs, would just dissipate, almost as if someone had turned off all the background music with the flick of a switch. Also, there were times when the woodland animals behaved in strange, bizarre ways, looking anxiously towards the woods and hightailing it out of there in a quick, hasty gallop, almost as if they sensed a vicious predator of some kind was in their midst. So we did indeed witness all these strange idiosyncrasies, as well as sense and experience eyes on us a lot of the time, but once again we kept drawing blanks in our search for this evasive, elusive and mythical creature. One evening, as I was sitting by the fire pit on a cool summer evening in the Ozarks, I think it was, because believe me, we've been almost everywhere, so it's a challenge for me to literally pinpoint every location for you that we have actually visited. As we were eating a freeze-dried meal of macaroni, cheese and sausages, my friend Mark started registering his complete exasperation about our seemingly fruitless and futile search for Bigfoot. "I am so frustrated," he said. "I wanted to kill the thing so we could prove to the world once and for all that Bigfoot exists." It was when the other friend of mine also agreed that killing a Bigfoot was what needed to be done that I realized in horror that these guys were not my friends. I had no desire to kill the creature. Not at all. I just wanted to encounter the beast. I discerned with horrified revulsion and sickening disgust that their motives on coming on these Bigfoot expeditions with me was nefarious, to say the least. I realized suddenly that I had drawn the short straw, and so I disassociated myself in engaging in Bigfoot research with any of these guys ever again, and I never saw them, not once. When I returned to Seattle, I worked my way up to becoming a restaurant manager at a well-known, long-established restaurant chain. But I spent all my spare time camping, fishing, and hiking, but thoughts of pursuing Bigfoot were far from my mind, because in truth I'd given up on actually finding him, and my dream was definitely over. The thought about ever encountering the creature did seem crazy now, and besides I was so engaged in a very busy, hectic lifestyle. It was while I was working at a restaurant manager that I actually met Liesel, who was introduced to me by one of my waitresses. Liesel and I connected almost immediately and began dating. It was when our relationship became much more serious that Liesel decided that she wanted to introduce me to her wonderful, warm and engaging family, who just so happened to live in West Virginia. While I was staying with Liesel, Mark, one of her brothers, had booked a surprise romantic retreat to a remote, very idyllic area for the weekend with his fiancée, Hazel. It transpired that poor Hazel had come down with a very bad bout of flu, and so Mark very generously gifted us with a holiday retreat package, because neither of them were going to be able to go on this exciting escapade, and it would be a pity to waste it. I'm not going to tell you where this beautiful retreat was for obvious reasons, but what I will say is that it was quite literally in the middle of nowhere, and was a place well off the beaten track, with no sign of human habitation for many miles. Even with my GPS navigator, I kept getting lost as we kept losing connection on our drive. Finally, we found the place set against an old logging road. It was the most enchanting, exquisite cabin that I have ever seen, and whomever designed this intriguing, congenial place had literally transformed it into the most sumptuous, cosy, luxurious den, with comfortable couches, king-size beds, with fabulously soft feather duvets and pillows, not to mention large romantic stone fireplaces in every single room, and a very modern state-of-the-art kitchen. There was also a wraparound wooden deck which overlooked the most gorgeous views onto the towering mountainous valleys, rugged rocky outcrops, and beautiful resplendent emerald green forest that literally stretched back for hundreds of miles, that was full of sycamore, birch, green ash, honey locust, and eastern white pine trees, and truly it was just so stunningly beautiful, and I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to stay at such a serene, tranquil dwelling in such an enchanting place like this. Being so remote, naturally everything was off-grid, but very well managed, with solar systems that are used by fish and wildlife and provide you with electricity and hot water, so all the luxury amenities were available to us. That evening, Liesel and I prepared a fire pit with my favourite fire starter, which is a little secret I learnt from a tracker friend of mine, which is using cotton wool laced in petroleum jelly and putting them all in a plastic bag, and it works like a dream to get the fire going in every situation, especially when weather conditions are challenging. So if you haven't tried it, please give it a go. You'll be glad you did. Liesel and I sat back on our comfortable chairs by this fire pit, cooking barbecue ribs and watching the glorious golden sun setting over the valley in an artist's palette of magnificent pinks, yellows, tangerines and golds. Finally the sunset faded, and a dusky darkness cloaked the whole valley, and then the jewels of the vast firmament made their presence known, and soon we were gazing up at the soft light of the pearly moon and the twinkling diamond-like jewels of the sparkling stars. We could hear the chorus of the crickets and the sounds of the frogs, and it was absolutely gorgeous. I could live here forever, sighed Liesel happily. This is the dream life. It is magnificent, I agreed. Suddenly in the valley we heard whooping sounds, but I did not even register or think about Bigfoot Not for a second. It was very odd. "How peculiar," said Liesl to me. "I wonder what those strange sounds were. They sound different to other animal sounds you usually hear." I did not give her comment any thought, I kid you not. The next morning Liesl and I did a little hiking through the wooded area, and right in the middle of the woods we came to a little clearing where there was a gorgeous little stream running through the woods, surrounded by a large, smooth, rocky outcrop, and the water ran through the area with a very swift current, so that the crashing sound of the water hitting the rocks furiously was unusually calming. Suddenly Liesl was getting very excited and asked me to shush, and she was beckoning me to follow her very silently. I followed her cautiously, knowing that she had seen something. "Be very quiet," she said, pointing to some rocks. "Look over there. Can you see it? It's a mother bear with 2 of her cubs. We must be very careful. They can be very protective over their young and get very dangerous and aggressive." Feeling a flurry of excitement because I absolutely love bears, and although we were carrying a rifle, bear spray and an air horn, I definitely did not want to be using any of these things today. We found a rocky outcrop that overlooked the back of the bear. I could tell it was a great deal bigger than the average black bear and was hazel in colour and not black. I studied the creature closely, and there were 2 bodies next to her, suckling her breasts, one on either side. But this was no bear. I looked again, and in my binoculars I could see the long hands and flat nail ridge, and I began to feel my heart beating violently in my chest, not in fear, but in utter awe and disbelief. How could this be possible? I was observing a mother Bigfoot with her twins. It didn't get better than this. "It's Bigfoot," I whispered to Liesl excitedly. "It's a mother Bigfoot with twins." Liesl and I kept fighting for the binoculars because we were so excited to observe these creatures, and the view we had on the mother was absolutely stupendous and amazing. Only I did wish with all my heart that she would just turn around, just so that I could see her face. Then suddenly, as if on cue, she did, and she appeared to be looking at a large pile of twigs that was lying on her side. And then I saw her in all her glory, and as I write this I am shaking with excitement as I relive that extraordinary memory of when I first laid my eyes on Bigfoot. The Bigfoot was colossal in size. She towered at about 8 feet tall, was about 700 pounds, and 4.5 feet wide. From her head to her toes she was covered in a luxurious coat of long flowing hazel hair that in certain shafts of sunlight possessed a very glorious golden hue. This creature was utterly magnificent. She was majestic, lofty, powerful, and exceedingly agile. Her bullet-shaped head blended seamlessly onto her huge shoulders. I noticed her arms were very long, and her legs were slender and toned, but her whole body was taut with very powerful muscle definition, and there were no signs on her torso that she'd recently given birth, because her stomach muscles were clenched and very ripped. I could see that clearly, because the hair on her stomach area was much less dense. Her face was beautiful, with a joyful countenance, which I imagine was due to being a very proud mother. I noticed that her brown eyes were a rich cocoa colour, and they were expressive and humourful. The skin was a leathery texture and was a deep chocolate colour, and she had a very prominent brow ridge, flat nose, and very slender mouth. Her 2 little younglings were the cutest balls of fluff that you have ever seen in your entire life. They were utterly gorgeous and adorable, and believe me, they were as fluffy as well as exceedingly mischievous. I'm not sure how old they were, because they were very small in size, like 2-year-old toddlers, but they were both still suckling, and unlike human toddlers that fall over all the time, these small humanoids were exceedingly agile, walking almost perfectly on 2 feet, without encountering any problems at all, and appeared to have no fear of the gushing current of the stream. The mother kept grabbing twigs for her little toddlers, throwing them towards her younglings like you might throw a stick for a dog. Her little sprogs would catch them and bring them to their mothers, who would show them how to snap them. The little Bigfoots watched their mother snapping the twigs with wide, curious brown eyes that seemed almost too big for their angular faces. When she snapped the twig, they would try and copy her, and when they succeeded, they would make a happy whooping sound. Whoop! It was like she was teaching them how to snap twigs, but I realized she was showing them different types of twigs from varying species of different trees. Her sprogs examined everything very closely. The unique twigs, the twigs were unique, some were harder to break than others, and the sprogs found this very interesting. She appeared to be chattering away to her younglings and teaching them about the twigs and the nature of the bark. It was incredible to watch, and I realized how privileged Liesl and I were to witness such an amazing scene. After their lessons, the younglings perched on their mother's torso and proceeded to drink a little more milk from her furry breasts, pressing them hungrily with their eager hands to extract as much milk as possible. Her beautiful younglings played together, probing the twigs themselves and choosing which ones to actually break. If they struggled to break a twig, they brought it back to their mother, who would show them how it was properly done, until they more or less got the hang of it. I do not know how long we watched the mother and her cubs, but it was for a very long time. Finally, she waded into the shallow water to refresh herself, with her cubs tottering beside her. We watched her splashing her dark leathery face with the water, and her two little cubs instinctively imitated their mother and began splashing their tiny, cute little faces, clearly delighting in the experience. Finally, Mother Bigfoot lifted up her two offspring and put each one on either side of her massive shoulders, where they sat very comfortably, and she literally glided away on her long legs with a seamless fluidity and grace, unlike anything that I've ever seen before. It took me a long while to recover from what I'd actually seen. I could not believe the irony of all ironies. For so many years I'd spent copious amounts of money, tackled some of the most challenging terrain, overcome huge obstacles, and experienced all manner of arduous weather conditions, from snow, sleet to frozen rain, as well as all in hot pursuit of Bigfoot. And now, on an unlikely off-the-cuff chance weekend away that was never intentionally orchestrated in the first place, I had encountered a mother Bigfoot with her twins, and this encounter was one that far surpassed my greatest expectations, because let's face it, this one was one heck of an encounter. Looking back, I realized one thing about these incredible creatures, and that is that they are experts at remaining hidden, and I think they'll only show themselves to you on their own terms, because I think they know when you're looking for them. Perhaps they have some mind-reading capabilities and can even read our intentions. Liesl and I got married about a year ago, but once a year I book that retreat in the hope of encountering that awesome mother Bigfoot again. So now you know why I don't want to tell you where that retreat is. So there you are. I hope you enjoyed my story.
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Amanda, and I grew up in Georgia, and I had my Bigfoot encounter in 1980 when I was a little girl of only 10 years old. My birth 10 years prior came as a big, fortuitous, unexpected bombshell to everyone. At the time, my mother never knew she was actually pregnant with me, and sadly suffered from a debilitating mental illness, which only compounded her extreme confusion. It appears that she woke up during the night to find her waters breaking. I gather she became overwrought and hysterical, believing that she was actually dying at the time, as she did not know what the strange, peculiar thing was that was actually happening to her body. My grandmother naturally knew immediately what was going on the day my mother's waters broke, as invariably most women would who had been through the birthing process themselves. However, it did come as an awful surprise even to her, because her daughter had none of the typical signs associated with pregnancy, such as the obvious weight gain, food cravings, and morning sickness. However, my mother's mental illness had caused her to engage in careless, promiscuous impropriety, which was a very big side effect of her mental condition. So my grandparents had been warned by the medical profession that she could end up getting pregnant by surprise. This meant we could never establish who my real father was, which, as you can imagine, was always hard for me to come to terms with growing up. To cut a long story short, my grandmother helped deliver me at the back of her Mustang on the way to the hospital, and believes it was one of the most marvellous and memorable events of her entire life. Even though I came along as an unexpected bundle of surprise to my grandparents, I was one of the greatest and most precious gifts that ever graced their lives. Unfortunately, my mother's mental illness got progressively worse, especially after I was born, and her behaviour became increasingly more bizarre and erratic. One day she went on a shopping trip and forgot me along with her shopping. Apparently she paid for all her groceries and abandoned everything. She was found later wandering around a parking lot, looking terribly confused and disorientated. The police were called, and I was subsequently taken away from my mother, who was considered too mentally unfit to care for me. My mother was subsequently hospitalised for her mental condition, which was not properly ever diagnosed, and she would spend her life in and out of various mental asylums and psychiatric hospitals while I was growing up. Sometimes I would visit her in these soulless prison-like buildings upon the insistence of my grandmother, who believed it was absolutely imperative that I got to know my mother, even though she was not completely of sound mind. On the inside, these places were even worse than on the outside. All these years later, I cannot forget how grim, austere, colourless and clinical these places actually were, with a very sinister, disquieting, creepy kind of energy about them. The worst thing was the smell of urine that wafted and trailed down every single corridor, and attempts were taken to disguise the atrocious odour with heavy disinfectants, with little success, I might add. I would see some seriously disturbed, aggressive, pugnacious patients shrieking and being tied down to beds with leather straps by several frenzied doctors in white coats. The patients would be biting, screaming and kicking rebelliously. It was almost like they seemed to develop a supernatural strength, and my grandmother told me that some of the nurses at the facility believed that some of these mental cases they dealt with appeared to be people who were demonically possessed rather than mentally ill. On one occasion, the facility did actually ask a priest to come over to see a patient, as the woman in question was seen crawling up the wall with her head swivelling in peculiar angles, and she was growling and hissing belligerently. A priest was called to the suspected case of demonic possession, but after being attacked violently by the patient, he fled away in absolute terror, saying that he had seen the devil himself, and he never ever came back, he was so terrified. I gather they tried to keep that patient heavily drugged to incapacitate her seemingly incredible supernatural strength that never waned during her entire incarceration at that facility. I never did actually find out what became of her. Then there were these wacko people with their white, doughy, anemic skins, running down the corridors with contorted expressions on their faces, shrieking and screaming like demented animals, oscillating their arms in defiant gestures, while hospital staff dashed after them to sedate them and calm them down. It was literally terrifying to observe, and truly these patients would send chills down my spine, because some of them looked like the Walking Dead that you see on those zombie movies. This sort of thing really did happen in those days. When we would visit my mother, she was sometimes so spaced out that she would not even know you were actually there, and she never seemed to understand that I was actually her daughter. It would be like she would be staring blankly at the ceiling and then pointed at things with a wacko, loony look on her face that neither my grandmother or I could actually see. She would see spiders crawling up the walls and monsters that weren't there, and she would hear voices in her mind drumming away in her head, and would complain relentlessly that these voices would never stop instructing her day and night on what she needed to do. I would be so disturbed by those visits to the mental asylum to see my mother that I simply detested going to those places, as horrible as this sounds, and I never considered my mother to be my mother. Her strange mannerisms and weird, erratic, somewhat bizarre deportment meant that she had no place in my young life, and I really tried not to think about her in that gruesome mental facility. As a result, I was legally raised by my true grandparents, who had sole custody over me. We lived in the heart of the Georgia countryside. My grandparents were pretty elderly at the time, but they gave me an absolutely amazing upbringing. We lived in an idyllic little quintessential 1800s farmhouse that was restored and renovated in the early 70s and was in excellent pristine condition, still maintaining the historic integrity of the building. Our farmhouse was situated at the back of a very large dirt road, where the bordering embankments consisted of thorny briars, where huckleberries and blackberries would grow wildly and were wonderful to eat in season. I used to pig out on those things and return home with blue stains all over my mouth. We were also situated close to many hiking trails and vast areas of natural forest that literally stretched back for hundreds of miles. They consisted of red cedar trees, oaks, maples, sweet gum, and plenty of other varieties of tall, majestical trees that towered in the blue-grey firmament like masterful statues covered in carpets of golden-green leaves. My grandparents had a huge orchard on the left-hand side of our property where we grew those typical peaches Georgia is so famous for, as well as juicy, delicious plums, pears and pecans. My grandmother made the best peach cobblers you have ever tasted and pecan nut pies that were so scrumptious, and she literally won prizes for her cooking prowess because they were so good. It was said that many people who visited my gran deliberately dropped by in the hope of having a helping of her peach cobbler because they were so good. We grew up our own vegetables and we raised chickens and a few goats, which always wore large bells around their necks, so you could always hear their pretty bells tinkering all over the countryside, which was so quaint. My grandfather had a particular penchant for goats and had always loved them, almost as much as his 2 devoted black Labrador dogs that literally followed him everywhere he went, as if they were joined to his hip. Our cosy, sumptuous home was surrounded by magnificent undulated emerald green valleys and rambling countryside that, as I told you before, spread back for miles. As a young girl, I was strongly forbidden to go exploring in the forest because I was informed that it was not safe because of wild animals. I was told that I should just play in the yard close to the house, but as my grandparents were elderly, every time they invariably indulged in an afternoon siesta, I would rebelliously take that opportunity to go exploring in the woods. I was a fearless child that simply loved exploring and adventuring, and I loved frolicking around in the woods and perceiving all the animals, especially the squirrels, because they have fascinated me so much for some reason. I loved the way that squirrels would nibble and gnaw the acorns with their dainty little paws, staring at you with their alluring, bright brown eyes. I watched them, seemingly engrossed for hours, scampering and scooting up onto trees, with such nimbleness and dexterity, and I was totally transfixed by them. I thought they were the most incredibly beautiful animals in the whole wide world, and nothing matched them. My grandfather, who was once a keen squirrel hunter, was prohibited by my grandmother to hunt squirrels ever again, because I loved them so very much. One time when I was about 7 years old, he came back from a hunt in the woods with a huge handful of squirrel pelts, and I just cried and cried like a baby because I was so utterly dismayed. I was so passionate about squirrels that I tirelessly read all Beatrix Potter's books with a fervent passion, and I adored all the superb illustrations. Squirrel Nutkins was my favourite character. He was an impertinent red squirrel, and the story was about his narrow escape from an owl called Brown Owl. I was always so happy that the naughty squirrel managed to escape the predatory eyes of this horrible owl. My whole bedroom was covered with posters of squirrels. My grandfather once came into my bedroom, sat on my bed, and looked at all my squirrel posters with a perplexed, somewhat intrigued look on his face, and he even looked at my Beatrix Potter's pictures of Squirrel Nutkins. "Why do you like squirrels so much?" he asked me quizzically. I replied, "They're so cute, funny and clever, and they're my best friends." My grandfather looked at me and said, "You're a funny one." "You are." He ran his hands through my hair, shook his head, and said, "I wouldn't change you for the world." One day when I ventured into the woods shortly after my grandparents were having their afternoon siesta, I distinctly heard gunshots, and I knew at once that someone was hunting illegally on our land. I could not tell my grandparents about what I'd heard, because I didn't want to be chastised by them for daring to venture into the woods on my own without adult supervision. I had heard these gunshots before, but this time they were very close by to our farm. So close, in fact, that I was quite surprised that my grandfather had actually not heard them. I was worried that some of the precious squirrels were being shot and killed. That was the terrifying, taunting, alarming thought that went whirling around my young head like a Ferris wheel. Naturally, I felt very protective towards the squirrel population, so I ventured cautiously ever closer towards the hunters without any worry for my own safety. My only concern was the welfare of my beloved squirrels. I remember creeping very cautiously into the woods, making sure that I was not disturbing any leaf litter or twigs under my feet, so as to avoid drawing unwanted attention to myself. I crept behind a tall red cedar tree, where I hid covertly, watching the hunters. I heard them talking together about a particular deer that they wanted to take down, so I was momentarily reassured that they were not after any of my squirrels, and that was a huge relief to me as far as I was concerned. "You're a dreadful shot," I heard one of the men say. "You miss every time. That deer's long gone now. We'll have to come back next time, but I'll be the one shooting, you hear me?" "I'm not a bad shot," chided the other man. "I just missed, that's all. It can happen to anyone." He sounded extremely annoyed. "No, you're a bad shot," insisted the other man. "You're just not a natural hunter like I am. I would have taken that thing down in a second. The trouble with you is you're not coordinated enough, and your fingers wobble on the trigger, and you shake." "We'll see about that," said the other man again, sounding equally more annoyed. "You'll be eating your words. I'm not as clumsy as you're making me out to be." I could hear these men were having a major disagreement together about their hunting prowess, or lack of it, so to speak. I did feel angry that these men were illegally poaching and had the audacity and nerve to hunt on my grandfather's property, especially as it was not even hunting season. I suddenly recognised one of the men as a farmhand my grandfather had once hired a year earlier to help around the farm. I imagined he knew my grandfather's woods pretty well, which was the reason why he was probably poaching here in the first place, as he understood the layout of the land, and he knew we had some extensively hefty deer population that found refuge and sanctuary and safety in our woods, because they were never really hunted. As I pondered all these thoughts in my mind, suddenly I heard a very heavy, thunderous sound coming through the woods, and it sounded like something stupendous was coming towards us, but it sounded distinctly bipedal. The only problem was that a human being could not make such a monstrously huge commotion as this thing was, and this thing was on 2 feet. Whatever this thing was, it was spectacularly heavy, and it sounded like a herd of rhinos that was racing through the woods at an alarming momentum. The 2 men became very startled, and I could tell by their wide eyes and open jaws that hung to the ground that they were utterly terrified. One of the men said, "What the heck was that? Did you hear it?" The other man was shaking so much, all he could say was, "It's coming, it's coming." Then out of the shadows I suddenly saw this massive creature rising from the undergrowth on 2 huge muscular legs. The creature was unlike anything I've ever seen or witnessed in my entire life. I was young at the time, so was not good at estimating sizes, but I will say that this thing was colossal. Looking back, he could easily have been over 1,000 pounds, 5 foot wide and 10 foot tall. He was covered from head to toe with brown hair that in certain beams of sunlight I noticed had a very distinctive auburn hue. I do recall the hair was long, distinctly human-like, and very glossy and shiny. I remember thinking how pretty the colour actually was. The creature was mammoth, monster if I ever saw one. He was an apex predator, equally on par with a lion or rhino, and possibly more so. He was powerful, athletic, excessively muscular, agile and majestic, and he had a very distinct ape-like appearance, especially noticeable with the heavy shoulders that sported a cone-shaped head. He had nut-brown eyes, set in long brown leathery skin, with a prominent furrowed brow ridge, very flat nose, and a very visible pink nostrils, and human-like slender mouth. I also noticed that the creature had a very overlong pair of arms that hung below his knees, and I'm willing to bet that he could touch his toes without bending over. The creature was absolutely incensed with these 2 men, and they were trying to shoot at the creature in fear, running backwards in the process, too terrified to turn around, in case the hairy humanoid pounced on them in surprise. Shooting at the creature was a monumental mistake on their parts, and it only served to escalate the creature's rage. He let out a thunderous roar and shrieked so loudly that the sound went right through me. He sounded exactly like a woman being murdered when he made a noise. He lunged towards the men and literally tossed one of the shrieking men in the air like a pizza, but he caught the man in his arms before he actually fell to the ground. I have no way of describing this bizarre event to you, other than it looked like the creature was throwing the man up and down and intentionally catching him every time he descended towards the ground. The man kept screaming, "Help! Help! Help!" while the other man just hightailed it through the forest, and in the distance I could hear him starting up his car engine, stalling several times, and then whizzing away in his car at a lightning speed, leaving his friend alone in the woods to face the full wrath of this ferocious, formidable beast. I remember thinking what a fair-weather man that his friend actually was for running off like that, without actually assisting his mate. Eventually the creature threw the man into the air one more time, and particularly broke his fall midway so as not to kill him, but to cause significant damage and an extensive amount of bruising. Once he'd done this, he made a few angry grunts, and then he just disappeared into the woods on his long, agile legs, leaving the man stranded in the woods, sitting on the ground looking quite dazed, confused and shocked, hardly daring to believe that he had not been killed and had actually escaped with his life. I realised that the injured man was in fact the farmhand that my grandfather had hired last year. I really do not think the creature was intending to kill him, but I think he wanted the men off his land, and that was the distinct impression I got. It was as if he was warning the men off his turf. So to speak, he was giving them a clear warning message: do not come back here again, or I promise you I will not be responsible for what I do next time. That was the kind of message he was giving out. You're probably wondering what my reaction was to this strange creature. Well, it terrified me, to be sure, especially because it was so monstrously huge and powerful, but at the same time I was so stunned by seeing such a peculiar creature in our woods that bore a strong resemblance to an ape, and yet at the same time had a very distinct human-like trait. I truly think I was somewhat strangely bedazzled and in awe of the creature, so much so, in fact, that I believe my terror was marginally suppressed by sheer amazement and awe that this majestic, lofty and powerful creature had aroused within me. I was also amazed by how intelligent this creature actually was. I did ponder as to what the strange creature could actually be, as I'd never heard of such an amazing creature existing in North America before. I watched the man struggling to get up. He was groaning in pain and clutching his leg. He could barely move, so I surreptitiously slipped out of the woods as quietly as I could. I called my grandfather, but I told him I'd seen someone going into the woods, a man, and I didn't want to tell him what I'd seen for fear of being reprimanded for going into the woods myself without being supervised. I knew that if I told him I'd been in the woods, that I'd be grounded and get into trouble. My grandfather muttered something angrily under his breath about poachers, and then got his rifle, escorted by his 2 devoted Labradors, and proceeded into the woods. A while later he came back, helping our old farmhand into the kitchen, asking him what on earth he had done to himself and why he was in the woods in the first place. "I thought I'd take a shortcut," he lied. "I was coming to see you to see if you had any jobs going, as I'm a bit strapped for cash these days. I was walking and got caught up in some old tree limb and had a bit of a nasty fall." "A bit of a fall?" laughed my grandmother, mopping the man's wounds with her disinfectant. "You look like you've been through a mince grinder. But luckily you'll make a full recovery in a few days, but you will need lots of rest. I can see you've sprained your ankle very badly there." My grandmother insisted that the farmhand stayed in our home until he had been nursed better and had fully recovered, and my grandfather gave him a job around the farm. I was secretly irritated that they were helping out this dishonest farmhand, but I never had the guts to tell my grandparents anything about what I'd seen that day, nor about the strange hairy humanoid that I'd actually encountered. One day we got a call from the mental facility telling us they were closing down. There was a mention of Ronald Reagan in all the papers. He was closing down some of these nefarious institutions. We were told that my mother could come home and needed to be collected the very next day, and she only needed a few assistance with some medication. That was all. I'm sure they were telling everybody that had a relative in a mental facility that they could all come home, because the government was shutting all these places down and the patients had to be relocated. I was absolutely terrified because my mother was bark raving mad. And hearing this, my grandmother was so flustered that she actually dropped all the hen's eggs on the floor that were gobbled up gratefully by Bella, our rambunctious Labrador. Then she even forgot to put baking powder in her chocolate cake and produced a flat pancake instead that looked remarkably like a kombucha SCOBY. Never once had I ever seen my grandmother so dithery before. I knew she was not looking forward to my mother coming back into her childhood home with the three of us. My grandfather also walked around the place wearing such a perturbed, troubled expression on his face, and I could tell he was disquieted about my mother's return. When my mother did come home, it was absolutely awful for all three of us. She hardly acknowledged us and walked around aimlessly in a non-compos mentos state, sometimes banging her head against the walls in a psychotic way, causing her head to bleed. So even my grandmother had to bandage it up. I would wake up in the middle of the night, sensing that something was staring at me, and I'd look up to find my mother gawking at me with those vacant eyes of hers. She would stand over my bed, staring and staring at me. I was so terrified because she looked so deranged, especially when she was wearing her white gown and a head bandage. Sometimes I would go into her bedroom and she would be rocking backwards and forwards in a restless way that made it look like she was possessed. If you would talk to her, she would never say a word. You were always met by this big wall of silence. Believe me, we had doctors and priests around to our home, but any alterations to her meds and any prayers that were said made her condition 1,000 times worse and only exacerbated her chronic medical state. One night I woke up to hear the strange commotion going on. I looked out of my window, and luckily our porch light was on. My mother was doddering unsteadily on the lawn in her white nightgown, oscillating her arms in octopus-like motions. In her hand she was holding a screwed-up white sheet, and I saw her bounding into the woods with a purposeful intent. I immediately put on my sneakers, and armed with a flashlight, I dashed into the woods after my mother, calling her name, but she never answered me. "Cynthia, Cynthia," I called, but there was absolutely no response. Everything in the forest was so airily quiet that it felt incredibly sinister and creepy. You could have heard a pin drop. I remember I heard no owl hoots, no croaking frogs, no crickets, or even the sounds of distant coyotes. So I knew my mother was attempting to do something really stupid, and it seemed that my instincts were absolutely right. Then I saw her standing in the darkness like a ghostly white shadow. She appeared to be wrestling with an elevated tree branch and proceeded to make a noose to hang herself with. I let out a gut-wrenching scream. "No, no, no, please don't!" She was placing her head in the noose, and the fabric was tightening around her neck. In that moment I heard a thunderous pair of feet rushing forwards and tearing the sheet apart with effortless ease with its monstrous huge hairy arms. I realized it was the hairy giant I'd once seen in the woods before. His demeanour was quite different this time. He was not angry but concerned. It was like he sensed that my mother was not right in the head, and he knew that what she was trying to do to herself. I watched him shredding the sheet into hundreds of tiny pieces, and it lay scattered on the ground like streams of white confetti. My mother was absolutely furious with the creature and pounded his hairy chest with her fists, crying, "No, no!" The creature was unfazed and not at all retaliatory. I was horrified to see my mother so boldly and aggressively attacking this gargantuan, hairy humanoid. She looked like a stringy white Barbie doll beating King Kong. The Herculean-sized creature simply lifted my mother into his powerful arms, kicking and screaming through the woods towards our home. He calmly put her down gently at our kitchen door. I'd followed him all the way, knowing in my gut that this majestic creature was helping us and had saved my mother's life. For a moment my eyes locked with the creature's, and I could feel this warmth flooding through my body. It was as if he was saying, "It's going to be fine, don't worry." Suddenly I heard my grandfather's footsteps shuffling to the door, and his grumbling voice saying, "What's going on? Who's making such a commotion at this time of night?" I watched the creature gliding away into the woods, and his movements were seamless. He looked as if he was literally floating away. I was in awe of his majesty and magnificence. To cut a long story short, after my mother's attempted suicide, my grandfather finally got my mother some expert help from a very well-renowned specialist at the time that put her on some life-changing meds that seemed to bring some balance and order into her life. But then she did stop taking her meds, unbeknown to us. When this happened, we would be back to square one again. It was a tumultuous time for us, and one day everything ended because my mum stepped out of our car on a busy highway and got run over and killed by a car. So it was very sad, but in a strange way, it did bring some kind of relief to us because we didn't have to worry about her for 24/7, because we were living on a knife edge at the time. All these years later, I realise that the hairy giant in the woods is a Bigfoot, and I think they're highly intelligent creatures, and they will help humans in grave situations. I emphatically believe that. I am almost certain they can read your energy. I also think they're very territorial and will defend their turf whenever necessary, like the creature did with those poachers. So there you are. That's my story. I think tonight's story is a real eye-opener for many of us because certainly it was for Matt. His story he was reluctant in coming forward with because, you know, he knows that this is a controversial subject when it comes to marriage, and certainly in his life he really struggled to be happy because he had a very difficult marriage to his wife Myrtle. And it was an enchantment encounter with a Bigfoot. When he saw this Bigfoot, and he had an encounter that really spoke to him in more ways than you can imagine, and that was when his life really took a miraculous turning. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Matt, and I'm from Seattle, and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in a very spontaneous road trip in my brother's RV that happened to me in 1989. I'd been married to my long-time wife, Myrtle, for over 10 long years, and we lived in a very lovely, cosy cottage-style home in Seattle, Washington, with its beautiful landscaped gardens and exquisite lakefront views. We lived in a very upmarket area of Washington. You would think that having such an idyllic lifestyle, living in the lap of luxury, surrounded by modern-day creature comforts, would bring me great pleasure, but it most certainly did not, because I was so miserable and desperately unhappy in my solitary, lonely little world. I was the one that arrived at work an hour earlier than the office regulars, and I was the one that would leave work so late that the cleaners had arrived in the office for their night shift duties. They would glance at me piteously as I gathered my belongings and my briefcase together to make my way back home. In truth, I had such an empty, meaningless and lonely life, of which there appeared to be no hope in the horizon and no opportunity for a brighter tomorrow. Every day was quite literally a colourless photocopy of the previous murky, dull grey day. It was a monotonous repetition of endless drudgery, of the incessant routine of daily life. My home life was so miserable that I focused all my attention in the workplace, and I worked as a banker, so my fastidious attention to detail was recognised by my superiors, and I was being continuously promoted and earning a very successful six-figure salary. I drove a 1989 Bentley Turbo R, and wherever I went I would observe the envious glances of regulars in downtown Seattle as they observed me driving my very opulent-looking car. I would often think to myself, if only you knew that you have nothing to envy. On the contrary, you probably have a much better life than I do. It would not have taken much to be marginally happier than I was, I can assure you. People always falsely believe that if you have money, you have everything. But I assure you that that is not the case. You can be rich and miserable, and happy and poor. It is, of course, infinitely more preferable to be rich and miserable than poor and miserable, because let's not kid, whatever way you look at it, the world isn't very kind to you when you have no money. How do I know this? Well, I came from a very impoverished background myself, and growing up I falsely believed society's message that money would just transform my life. So I knew that when I left home, I was going to make it big. That's exactly what I did, and that's what I pursued. I was a one child among 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and we grew up in a run-down, poverty-stricken area of New York. It was a tough life growing up, because we didn't always have enough food in the home, and that is difficult. There were days when we lived on toast and baked beans or spaghetti and tomato sauce. We grew up in a single-parent home, as my father absconded a very long time ago, and to this day I have no memory or recollection of him. I do know that he died about 10 years ago, but it did not have an emotional impact on any of us, because he had pretty much deserted and abandoned all of us, so we didn't really have much empathy about his passing, as insensitive as that may sound. In truth, things would have been very different if we'd actually known him. I gather he was actually quite a charming man. Even though our family was poor, we didn't lack love in our home, and despite the financial challenges we faced on a daily basis, we were incredibly close, loving and a happy family, with many beautiful memories that no money in the world can buy. When I was 20, I got married to my childhood sweetheart, Myrtle, and I really believed that she was the love of my life. But 2 years into our marriage, she quite literally turned into a vindictive bully. In her eyes, I was never good enough, and I was such a huge disappointment to her. There was nothing that I could do that was right in her eyes. I would literally come back home and sit down on the couch, and if I dared to relax, she would call me lazy and useless. We never relaxed or chatted together, but instead it was like there was a huge gulf that grew wider and wider every single day between us. We would both sit on the couch, eating a microwave dinner as Myrtle never cooked, and we would not be saying a word to each other the whole time, almost as if we were strangers in an office canteen. I kid you not, that was how emotionally disconnected and detached we were from each other. If I wanted to change the television channel to watch something else, there would be pandemonium in our home, as Myrtle would become irate and complain bitterly. "Why do you want to destroy my viewing?" she would shout, as if she was the only one that deserved consideration in our relationship. It was like the only person that deserved happiness was Myrtle, and nobody else mattered. Before long, it was easier to let her pretty much do whatever she wanted to keep the peace, and to indulge her with her long lists of jobs she required me to do around the home, and those lists were mile long. I was not exactly proficient at DIY, so I would end up being humiliated by my wife for my poor inferior workmanship. I withdrew into my shell, much like a tortoise, as a form of self-preservation, I think, and I became introverted, quiet and subdued, and she tirelessly nagged and nagged and nagged. I can truly say that I became lonely in my marriage, and my greatest, most powerful distraction was, in fact, work. I used every excuse in the book to avoid coming home at night, as much as I possibly could, because it felt like I was literally returning home to the enemy. We had everything we could financially ever need or desire, because my huge salary made that possible. But no matter how much money I was making, it was never enough for Myrtle, who was always quick to point out that someone else was making a whole lot more money than I was. That is a huge trap that people do get into when they become rich. Sometimes they develop this desirous need to hold on to more money than they will ever acquire in their lives. As you can imagine, there was a dreadful emptiness in my life that was beyond anything I could describe. My wife's persistent undermining and belittling of me was like a dripping tap, and it was the beginning to get to that place where I could stand it no longer. No wonder they used dripping taps as a form of torture in wartime situations when dealing with an adversary, because believe me, living with a nagging spouse or a dripping tap is absolutely no different. You are quite literally living with the enemy. My wife would say things to me like, "You're a waste of space. I do not know what I ever saw in you when I got married. I could have married someone so much wealthier than you." Her words would sting like salt on an open wound. You can imagine how devastating it is to live around such negativity. You truly are better off living on your own in such a situation. I truly do not want to engender pity from any of your listeners, believe me, as I paint my story into words. I just want to tell you exactly how it was. To the outside world and its social events, Myrtle and I looked as if we had the perfect married life and the most enviable marriage. And that's what Myrtle wanted people to believe. In public, Myrtle acted like the devoted, loving and adoring wife, but the moment we were back in the Bentley on our drive back home, she would be yelling and complaining about what I'd failed to say to her friends. Everything in my life was just a plastic facade. It was all about appearances and nothing about reality. I began to have a longing and yearning in my heart to escape it all and to leave Myrtle, but I never had the courage to actually break free from my trapped life. I guess the idea of leaving Myrtle and getting divorced was something that I would never have anticipated happening to me. I was the committed type that would stick at anything, come hell or high water, and divorce to me meant I'd failed in some way to make things work, and that simply was not a viable option for me. One day as I left the office, late to return home, and drove towards our magnificent Washington house, I parked my Bentley outside our gate and looked in. I could see through the large French windows and that the lights were on. In that moment I could taste the nausea rising up in my throat, and an overwhelming feeling of familiar dread overcame me, and I just knew in that second that I could not go back into that house. In fact, I never wanted to go back into that house ever again, if I could possibly help it. I found myself driving to my brother Stephen's house, and he lived in Washington, but in a much less ostentatious area than I did. He was very happily married to his lovely wife Hilda, and they lived in a very basic, rather rudimentary, rather simple home, but had a very satisfying life together, and they adored each other. They did have a few financial problems, like many married couples invariably do, but they had been trying to sell their RV for a long while to raise some much-needed extra cash. Quite suddenly I had a brainwave. I perceived what my next plan of action would be, which was a win-win situation for both of us. I wanted them to sell me their RV, and they could do with the money, and I could do with an adventure, some time and space away from my nagging wife. In short, I boldly revealed the secret that I had not divulged to a solitary soul until that moment. I explained to my horrified brother and his equally shocked wife Hilda that my marriage to Myrtle was indeed a huge sham, and that I'd not been happily married to her for a very long time, and I decided on a whim that I just wanted out. I needed to buy your RV right now, I told him. I'm leaving now. Are you sure you're doing the right thing, my brother said. Is this not all a little impulsive of you? Have you even told Myrtle about all this? And what about this road trip of yours? And what about your job? Do you not have to give them notice before you just disappear into the sunset like this? Isn't this a little bit hasty of you? The job's not a problem, I said. I've not taken a holiday for over 5 years now, and the bank hasn't been happy about that, so they'll be thrilled if I take some time off. As for Myrtle, I'd like you to phone her, I said to my brother. Tell her that I've gone away and that I've some serious thinking to do about the state of affairs between us. Is it not better that you speak to her yourself, said my brother. You don't know the real Myrtle, I said, like I do. She'll be bullying me to stay, and I'm so pathetically obedient, like a whipped dog, I'll go scurrying back. I know I will. I really need some space, and this is my opportunity to have some guts and do what I should have done a very long time ago. I had no idea you had such a miserable marriage, said Hilda, looking aghast. I'm just so shocked. I don't actually know what to say. You look like the happiest couple. I know you have a lot of money. Surely that's got to count for something. Surely most people would only dream of being as well off as you. Money, Hilda. That's what everybody thinks. You get rich and everything's suddenly hunky-dory. But I assure you it isn't like that. Life doesn't work like that. All my life I believed the false lie that money was the answer. Oh, it helps. Let's kid you not. And it does make life incredibly more comfortable, and there's a lot less worry to worry about on the financial side of things. All that's incredibly true. But you know what really matters at the end of the day? It's love and relationships. That's what really counts. That is what is truly sustaining and long-lasting. And I've been so lonely in my life with Myrtle for about 8 years now. No money in the world can buy back all that wasted time. I'd give anything to have what you and Stephen have, and you cannot buy that with any money. Wow! Things have been so tough for you, said Hilda, her eyes filling with tears. I've no idea that things were this bad. I so wish you'd confided in us. You could go to marriage counselling, Stephen suggested. They can work miracles these days. You could even see our pastor at the local church. He's really good. He could give you some sound advice on how to rekindle the flame. Are you going to sell me your RV or not? I asked, bringing out my chequebook and scribbling out a generous cheque for my brother. I really didn't need Stephen to go on about counselling. I'd been down that route before, and Myrtle was absolutely sure that I was responsible for her happiness. And one thing I've learnt in life is that we are responsible for our own happiness. My brother looked at the cheque and gasped. "That's way too much," he said. "The REV is not even worth that much. This is too generous. I cannot accept it." "It's only money," I said, "and if it can make a difference, then that's a good thing." "What about clothes?" asked my brother. "I can throw some of my stuff your way, because you might need something to wear. You're still in your suit, and you're going to need some rough clothes on your trip." "Come inside," urged Hilda. "Have a shower, a change of clothes, and a nice homemade meal inside you, and then you can be well on your way." "Where are you going to go?" asked my brother curiously over dinner. "I'm going to Vancouver," I said. "I fancy spending some time in the Canadian wilderness." "Haven't you got to have a passport for that?" "Aren't you going to need one?" "As it so happens, I keep my passport with me," I said. "But I am going to need to leave my Bentley with you if you don't mind, but you're welcome to use it." "Wow, people really will think we've gone up in the world," laughed Hilda. So there I was, out in my new second-hand RV, on the open road, on a wild, spontaneous, impulsive adventure, and I truly felt like a caged bird that had finally been given a brand new pair of wings and was set free. It was quite simply the most liberating feeling that I've ever felt in my life. I was driving the 1980 Jamboree Class C camper, which had plenty of sleeping space inside for me, a lovely kitchenette area and a small shower. It would be perfect for all my immediate needs. It was dark when I left my brother's house, and I was so excited. I could feel the butterflies in my stomach because I knew that this trip was going to be an adventure of a lifetime, and I could hardly wait. I took the I-5 north to Canada, and although it was dark, it felt beautiful driving in these wide open spaces, and I drove past the snow-capped peak of Mount Baker, and when it's light you can usually see the breathtaking views over the Cascade Mountains in the distance. Finally, I drove through the Canadian border with relatively ease and hardly any hold-ups, until I finally was in Canada. Fast forward 1.5 weeks. I'd been driving through the Canadian wilderness, visiting so many magnificent, intriguing and exciting places, and meeting so many wonderful and interesting people. For the first time in my life, I began to feel vibrant and alive again, more like the old person I had long since lost touch with. I had not even given Myrtle a second thought, and I could not decide whether that was a good thing or not. I just knew it was wonderful to be out of the viper's nest and to be footloose and fancy-free, as selfish as that may sound. All I needed to concern myself with every day was where I was going to spend the next night in my RV and what places to visit and explore each day. It was on a chance encounter at a local bookshop in Vancouver when I was buying a map of the area that a delightful elderly customer, who was clearly a local, asked me if I was new to Canada. When I told her all about my RV adventure and all the exciting places that I had actually visited, she graciously gave me the name of a remote, very scenic location that was in the middle of nowhere. "You simply must go there. It's quite literally the most magnificent, gorgeous place," she said, "and it's teeming with wildlife, and it's got wonderful, vast areas of woods to explore. You'll just love it there. It's so solitary and so peaceful." When she gave me all the details, I checked the map, and the area she mentioned was so remote it was not even properly marked on the map. But I did have a fair idea where I could find it from what the kind lady had actually told me. I found myself driving down a very bumpy dirt road with high rocky elevations on both sides, and further back you could just see the never-ending expanse of the towering aspen, cottonwood, black spruce and pine trees that literally went back for many miles. Finally the road came into a fork, and I took the right turning until I came to an iron gate with the name Black Spruce on it. I opened the gate and drove down the long rocky road that twisted and turned until finally I came to a clearing with a sign that read, "RV campers and hikers welcome," but I could see I was the only one there. Naturally, that didn't bother me or concern me at all. On the contrary, I was very happy to feel so isolated and cut off from the material world. The jewels of nature and her ravishing bounty far surpassed anything that she could offer, that was for certain. I parked the RV in a very spectacular spot under a large aspen tree that overlooked the shimmering silver lake lake that reflected on its surface the superb mountainous valleys and the towering, majestic aspen trees. It didn't get better than this. I felt as if I'd quite literally died and gone to heaven. It was just so magnificent. That night I made a fire pit outside my RV and grilled some delicious and juicy burgers for myself, and I sat back to enjoy the magnificent sunset over the water that painted the blue-grey firmament in golden and tangerine hues, and then it all but faded to be replaced by the dusty, starry-filled night. I decided I would turn in early, and that's exactly what I did. It must have been about 12:10 at night when I sensed something was rattling my RV, as it wobbled under a vibration. My first impression was that there had been a mild earthquake, but then I realized that something or someone appeared to be shaking my vehicle and wobbling it intentionally, and whoever was doing this had to be very strong. Imagine my surprise when I pulled back the curtains to see this huge face staring back at me. It was too dark to get an impression of the face, but the eyes had a very distinctive red eye shine, and the face seemed dark and hairy. But nothing felt menacing. But in that moment I was half asleep, so I went back to bed, convincing myself that I was just dreaming. Even when I awoke the following morning, I meditated on my strange, very vivid dream that had felt so very real. I'm not a stranger to very lucid dreaming, and so I was emphatically believing that the rocking of my RV and the odd face at the window was just one of those things, a crazy lucid dream. That morning I decided that I would take a hike into the beautiful wooded area, and so I put on some hiking boots and prepared a slight picnic lunch, and armed with some bear spray and an air horn, I ventured into the woods. There are no words in the English language capable of describing the resplendence, magnificence of these woods. The tall, majestic trees, with their powerful, strong, barky girths, sometimes layered in carpets of pretty green moss, literally towered in the blue-grey firmament like statuesque emerald giants, and the scant spaces between the trees allowed enough shafts of sunlight to dance through the canopy and envelop the pretty fern-covered forest floor in a soft yellow light. The mellow, gentle ambience was made perfect by the cacophony of pretty bird songs, from pretty warbles to peeps, tweets, and chirping. It was a delightful, audible, sensory and visual experience. Suddenly the bird song retreated and just vanished and became airily quiet. Then I heard a growling sound, and I could hear something tearing through the bush. It sounded like two hefty creatures, and I was right. They came bolting past me, so intent on lashing out at each other that they barely noticed me standing there. In fact, they didn't notice me at all. Let me tell you that is very bizarre, because I have encountered bears in the past before, and they have a phenomenal sense of smell. These creatures had bounded past me, were actually two very large brown grizzly bears, and should have immediately reacted to my presence, but they didn't, not to mention my human-like smell. But I believe their sense of smell had been hijacked by the desire to acquire dominance over the other in order to win the female suitor and establish mating rights. I think this drive was so powerful that quite literally everything in their surroundings, not to mention their immediate environment, lacked any significance or relevance at this poignant moment in time. I did not know how to react, and I quickly just took cover behind a very large tree trunk, watching the scene unfold before me in horrified dismay, with my bear spray propped up in my hand in case I should need to have to use it. I did not want to draw attention to myself by walking away, so I just stood very still, believing this to be the best course of action at this immediate moment. These grizzlies were quite literally tearing each other apart. I know of no other way to describe it, and I knew that one of them would end up very seriously injured or even fatally wounded after the attack. One of the bears had an open, bloody gash on the side of his leg and a really nasty, jagged laceration, possibly caused by a bite, and I could see it was bleeding very, very badly. With all my heart, I wished that I could intervene and stop that terrible fight and encourage them to go their separate ways and not to harm each other so willfully like this. In that moment I realized how brutal and cruel nature can be, and it truly is about the survival of the fittest. so that the strongest gene pool flourishes. It is not vindictive, nor is it nasty. It is what it is. That is just nature for you. The survival of the fittest, I think that's what it's called. Suddenly I heard the most hideous scream that I've ever heard, and it truly sounded like a woman being murdered, causing my whole body to shake violently and to tremble in terror. It was quite possibly the most petrifying sound that I have ever heard in my entire life. What amazed me more was that the two grizzlies remained oblivious to that startling sound. They were so intent on killing each other and so focused on their fight that they seemed to block everything out, seemingly oblivious of anything happening around them. Then I heard a sound unlike anything I've ever heard before and hope to ever hear again, something that sounded like a rhino coming thundering and bolting through the woods. And whatever this thing was, it was clearly on 2 feet, and it was colossal. Then I saw her, and nothing prepared me for what I was about to see. She was definitely female, and easily over 9 foot tall and 800 pounds and 4 foot wide. She was covered from head to toe in soft, magnificent strawberry blonde hair that blew back in the winds. I knew she was female, not only because of her pert hair-covered breasts, but she possessed a very strong feminine energy that was undeniable. One thing that blew me away about her was the size of her gargantuan shoulders that were quite literally massive, and she was literally ripped with muscle from head to toe. She was formidable, majestic, powerful, lofty, and utterly magnificent. And I have no idea what kind of animal she actually was, but she looked like she was an amalgamation of an ape and a wild woman. She did possess the long arms so typical of the ape-like species, but despite their length they were more human-like and muscular. Her hands and feet were also human-like and monstrously big in their proportions. Her head was cone-shaped, and her face was long and angular and human-like, with big hazel-brown intelligent eyes, a large flat nose, and a slender mouth. I should have been terrified by this creature, but I was so shocked by what I was actually seeing. I did not know how to react to her. She commanded such respect that I was in awe of her. The hairy humanoid was not at all happy with these grizzly bears, fighting in the way that they actually were, and she seemed undaunted and unfazed about dealing with 2 massive, bad-tempered grizzlies. She literally pulled them apart with effortless ease, using her monstrous big arms to separate the 2 of them, and she released the most terrifying, frightening growl that was so intimidating that it caused my body to literally tremble and shake. When the grizzlies saw the humanoid, they almost cowered in horror. I've never seen grizzlies bolt off in the way that they both did, but they were clearly frightened of the ape. Maybe they had experienced with her before, I do not know, but I do know this: I have never seen grizzlies so frightened before. They usually aren't frightened of anything, but they were petrified of her. She managed to get them off to run in different directions, which was deliberate on her part, and I sensed she wanted to separate them and end the barbaric fight. I really believe that she hated fighting, and that's why she wanted to put a stop to it. I watched her squatting on the floor of the forest, basking in the soft shafts of sunlight, and she seemed to be enjoying her little moment of peace. She clearly loved the serenity of the forest and hated any conflict and discord. I could hear her whistling happily to herself, and then she raised herself off the ground with extreme agility, and I watched her glide out of the forest with a seamless grace and fluidity unlike anything that I've ever seen before. She really was quite magnificent in her pose, grace, strength, and splendour. I remember walking back to the RV, and it suddenly occurred to me the dream that I'd had the previous night. I wondered whether the strawberry blonde-haired ape was the creature that had been rocking my RV and peering at me through the window. Maybe it wasn't a lucid dream after all. Maybe it had actually been real. So I decided to investigate things when I got back to my RV, and believe it or not, I found a large humanoid footprint outside the RV window in the soft, moist sand, and that was where I'd seen the face peering at me. It measured 22 inches in size, and I'm almost certain that the footprint belonged to her. I think she must have been curious about me or something, but I do not believe she had any intention of harming me. She didn't have that energy about her. I stayed at the camping ground a couple more days and did some hiking, and although I never saw the hairy humanoid again, I sensed her presence and energy, and I believe she watched me and even followed me a little on my hike. I believe she was interested and curious about me. I think she was a very peace-loving, gentle but very intelligent creature. After watching the hairy humanoid ape, that I now know, all these years later, to be a Bigfoot, break up the fight between those two grizzlies, I had an epiphany. I realised that those two grizzlies represented Myrtle and myself, and we were quite literally tearing each other apart, so that we were bleeding and oozing from our wounds. The Bigfoot had made those two bears go their separate ways, so that they didn't end up killing each other, and suddenly everything made sense to me, and I knew what needed to be done. When I got back to Washington, I got a divorce from Myrtle, and to date I have never ever looked back, nor have I ever regretted those choices. I believe that Bigfoot showed me when it is not working, it just is not going to ever be fixed. Now, believe me, I'm not advocating divorce by any manner of means to any of your listeners, because I believe that some marriages can be saved, but mine was not salvageable. Myrtle and I were like those two grizzlies that needed to be separated before we ended up destroying each other or even killing each other. These days I have a spring to my step and cannot wait to get home to my beautiful wife, who I've been married now to for 20 long years, and I've never been happier. I feel privileged to have met a female Bigfoot in those woods, and I will never forget her because she helped me power steer my life in a whole new direction, although I doubt she's even aware how she impacted my life in that way. She made me realise the importance of living a peaceful, serene life. I gather Myrtle got married 3 more times to very wealthy men, but now she lives on her own and is rich and miserable. So money does not buy everything, and you are responsible for your own happiness. I'm writing this during the COVID-19 epidemic, so there may be people out there who've lost their jobs and are struggling financially. There may be people having rough times in their marriages, and my heart goes out to each and every one of them. My biggest life lesson in life is to live in peace and savour every day. But if something is sucking and draining the life out of your very soul, you might need to reconsider your options, because nothing is ever worth that. So that is my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is James, and I'm initially from Hampshire in England, and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me when I moved to America in 1986, after I married my American sweetheart Jenny, and then I moved with her to her country home in West Virginia, which is where I currently reside. Believe it or not, I have had 2 cryptid encounters in my lifetime, and the first one actually occurred in England, but at the time I had no idea what I was actually witnessing, and I was way too afraid to share my experience with anyone for fear of ridicule. In England we do tend to keep a stiff upper lip, and if we do see something that others might believe incongruous to our world, many of us are inclined to keep our mouths shut about such peculiarities that seemingly defy natural explanation or understanding. My somewhat bizarre story begins when I was between jobs. I took a short-term job as a bus driver in the Hampshire area, which required taking the bus at various stops to the local town of Andover. I would drive my bus through the ambling British emerald green countryside, passing quaint little pubs, pretty idyllic cottages, meadows full of grazing cows, sheep or even horses, wild flowers, and fields of crops. I do remember there was a T-junction on one of those country roads that had become incredibly hazardous for many drivers, which was a peculiar enigma because although the road was a little off the beaten track, it was not in an area of high traffic congestion at all, and it should never have been predisposed to drivers having such terrible accidents. The authorities had even put up a drive carefully sign on that section of the road. It so happened that one of my bus stops was at that Pacific Junction, where every day I would pick up an elderly lady in the close location to that area. The sweet elderly lady would take an eternity to get on and off the bus, as her tortoise-sized footsteps would slide precariously onto one step and then finally onto another. I was always terrified that she was going to fall over. "Hello, Mrs. Taylor," I said warmly to her. "Lovely day, isn't it?" The old lady, who was partially deaf, wobbled dubiously on her feeble, somewhat frail form, struggling to steady her body as she reached for the railings and manoeuvred her body forwards, fumbling with her arthritic fingers to open her purse and hand me a couple of coins for her bus fare, all the while nodding at me. I was just about to press down the accelerator after Mrs. Taylor had finally found a seat and moved the bus forwards, when I suddenly noticed this monstrously huge black-like dog creature standing on the side of the T-junction on two legs just like a human. In all my life I have never seen such an extraordinary creature. It was about 300 pounds, covered with dense, thick black hair, and standing on 2 feet. It had the most hostile humanoid red eyes that I have ever seen in my entire life. What the heck is that, I thought to myself, watching the strange bipedal humanoid dog-like creature with a look of stupefied horror developing on my face. Suddenly the creature started throwing a huge rock into the road towards an oncoming car, causing it to suddenly lose control, somersault in the air, crashing violently and landing upside down in a ruinous heap of macerated, pulverized metal. This happened so incredibly quickly, but it almost was as if time stood very still. Suddenly I saw a loose, limp white arm fall out of the car window, and I was pretty sure that the person was dead. It happened so speedily. I immediately called 999 and asked all my passengers on the bus to wait while I dashed off to attend to the driver in the accident. Everyone was making an excitable, buzzing commotion in the bus, as all eyes were peeled to the scene of the accident with a fascinated intrigue. "What happened?" came the shocked voices. "Poor thing, she must be dead," came another voice. "Look, her arm isn't moving." "What happened?" came another voice. On the side of the embankment were several large oak trees, and I saw the huge creature taking cover behind the shade of a very large, hefty oak, while he watched all the drama unfold, and I could tell he was enjoying the show rather too much for my liking. I knew that this dog-like humanoid had caused all the chaos and carnage on the road, wantonly, and was watching the flashing blue police cars and the ambulance red bright lights with a grotesque, macabre pleasure. "What the heck happened here?" asked the policeman, taking notes with his book. "I take it you saw what happened. You must be the bus driver that called in on the 999 call." "Well, yes," I said, "that's right." "Did you see what happened?" asked the officer, studying me carefully. "There was this weird dog-like creature on the road throwing a rock at the car. He's hiding behind that bush over there watching us," I said. The policeman looked at me and raised a quizzical eyebrow. I could tell by his ambivalent expression that he was questioning my sanity. "Sir, have you been drinking?" he asked. "You're not making any sense. I'm going to have to ask you to take a breathalyzer." I realized suddenly how crazy I must have sounded, so I said, "I was only joking, officer. I assure you I have not been drinking. I was just trying to be humorous. It's how I react in stressful situations, to make light of them," I said, thinking quickly on my feet. "I always appreciate a little humour, sir, but not in life and death situations like this. It is time to be serious. What did you actually see? Please try and remember. It's very important for my police report, as we have a high level of fatal accidents in this cross-section for some very bizarre, inexplicable reason. Well, I saw a flying rock, and then the car just lost control." "Where did the rock come from?" he asked me. "I'm not sure," I lied. "I think it came from behind that oak tree over there." "That's a long way for a rock to come flying towards a car," said the policeman, looking at me quizzically. "Well, that's what I saw," I insisted. The EMT came to us with a very grim, sombre expression written on his face that informed us that the body was indeed deceased, and as you can imagine, I was mortified. I had told the police that I saw the car had lost control because of a rock, but I knew that this monstrous dog was the real perpetrator of this tragic accident. Yet how could I tell anyone without sounding completely crazy? No one would ever believe me. As you can imagine, From that moment forward, I watched that T-junction like a hawk every time I went past that section of road in my bus to pick up Mrs. Taylor. But I did not see the creature again. One day after hours, I rode my mountain bike to the area and studied the area around the oak tree very cautiously, where I witnessed that the creature had been hiding that day. I noticed some monstrous dog-like impressions in the ground, and they were huge. And then I also discovered piles and piles of pheasant feathers, along with a random bird's head and a couple of feet lying sprawled under the tree. I knew at once the creature had done this, and was possibly living on grouse, pheasants, rabbits and squirrels in the local area. One day when I was buying some groceries at Waitrose in Andover, I did happen to bump into the police officer that I'd encountered at that accident site, and I'm glad to say he recognised me immediately, but he did tease me about my bad sense of humour. He told me that there had been 3 more fatalities at the site, and one lady who was in hospital had survived the harrowing accident at that intersection. I was to discover that the lady was actually a friend of my mother's, talk about a small world, and so I used that perfect excuse to go and visit her in hospital with some flowers from my mother. "That's so sweet of you, dear," she groaned. "How is your mother?" "Mother's fine," I said, "but more to the point, how are you after your harrowing ordeal? That was quite some accident you had. Do you have any recollection of what actually happened?" "It was a flying rock, and I lost control," she said. "Did you see a bipedal dog-like creature throwing a rock at you?" I asked, boldly figuring out that I might as well just get to the point for the hell of it. "Yes, I did," said the lady, looking at me in amazement. "I thought if I told anyone what I actually saw, they'd think I'd lost the plot. But I do know what I saw." "How do you know about this bipedal dog-like creature? Ghastly-looking thing, isn't it? And it's a big monster." "Well, I've seen him myself at the site of another accident, at the very same spot where you crashed," I told her. "I did try to tell the police, but he thought I was off my rocker and that I'd been drinking. Tell me, what did you actually see? Do you remember?" "Oh, yes, I do. You could never forget that face. That creature was enormous, evil-looking, giant-like dog standing and walking on 2 feet like a human, with horrible red eyes. I saw it actually further down the road as I advanced towards that T-junction, and for a moment I thought the gates of hell had actually opened, as quite literally I saw that thing that I can only describe as a dog-like demon staring at me and glaring at me with hostile, enraged, angry eyes. I could see that it was deliberately aiming a huge rock at my car as I approached that cross-section. All I know is that my car just lost control. It skidded violently, lifted off the road, and span towards the edge of the embankment, where it crashed violently, pulverizing the passenger side of my car completely. To think that my daughter Amanda was going to come with me that day, but actually decided to stay at home because of a serious migraine headache that wouldn't stop throbbing. For the first time in her life, my daughter was glad to have a banging headache, let me tell you that. You know, she could have certainly died on impact. I'm in no doubt about that. All of this happened because of that awful, evil dog. Yet if I tell anyone about what actually happened, they'll think I've lost my marbles or I've been smoking pot. "I agree," I said. "For the sake of your sanity, I'm afraid you must keep your mouth shut. No one will ever believe you." I was to learn that there were a few more accidents at that T-junction in the weeks that followed, but then they did finally and thankfully stop altogether. There were rumours that a strange humanoid dog had actually been seen loitering around the area, but no one was willing to believe such a preposterous, outrageous story. To this day I'm convinced I saw a dogman who got off scaring people half to death, causing accidents and even killing people. I do believe he was a physical creature living off the local wild animals in the area, but I believe this monstrous beast enjoyed engendering fear in humans. I am almost certain about that. It was 2 years after that precarious incident that I met my American girlfriend at a pub, and we were having lunch, and I was introduced to her, and from that moment on, we hit it off. It so happened that she was staying with relatives in the area and chose to prolong her stay because of me. In short, I asked her to marry me, and she persuaded me to move in with her in her home in America. Leaving my life in England behind was a huge adjustment for me, but my wife was worth it, and before long we moved into a pretty little cabin in a wooded area in a very idyllic location in West Virginia. It was somewhat off the beaten track, but only 20 minutes from the local town, which was where I decided to open up a very thriving bookshop. My wife was a very house-proud person, so she transformed our home into a sumptuous, cosy den full of homely, cheerful, soft furnishings and plenty of scatter cushions. One thing I can never get over is a woman's fixation with scatter cushions on couches and beds that invariably have to be removed before you actually get into the bed. But this is not the forum that I should use to discuss such a trivial female peculiarity. We were not living on a large plot of lands by any means, but enough land to raise our own chickens and to grow vegetables. My wife insisted on having a garden full of pretty flowers and a rockery and a greenhouse. On the left-hand side of our land was an area of forest that literally consisted of long-leaf pines, oaks, beeches, and hickory trees. The wooded area was teeming with wildlife, and we did occasionally get to see deer, rabbits, squirrels, and foxes on our land. From time to time we would have a visitation of the odd black bear, which would delight me to no end, because coming from England, seeing a bear in its natural environment was a huge thrill for me. My wife and I always kept our cars unlocked on the property, because there was no crime in the area, so we pretty much relaxed but with our coming and goings. I drove a black 8 Dodge Challenger, and my wife had a red 4-cylinder Ford Mustang. One day, as my wife was taking a short trip to the local town to stock up on groceries, she came rushing back into the house to ask me if I had put something smelly in her car. I went through her car with a fine tooth comb and found some long stray strands of human-like auburn hair lying on the back seat, but there was nothing else to speak of, but the place did smell. It smelled disgusting. It was rather like a wet dog, yeasty kind of sweaty odour that also had a stale urine kind of smell about it. I could not figure out what the smell actually was, but it did look like a strange animal had been lying on the back seat of my wife's car. How could they have got in there without opening the car door first, I thought, and that would require the dexterity of a human hand. So I'm not going to kid you, I was somewhat bemused and flummoxed by this whole mystery. Little did I realise that I would soon discover the answer to the mystery, sooner than I actually realised. What I'd like to point out is that my wife only ever used that car about once a week on a Thursday for her shopping. Otherwise it pretty much remained parked on our gravel driveway under the cover of 2 very large oaks indefinitely, and it was left in a very shaded, comfortable location. One afternoon when I'd come back from work, I decided to ride my mountain bike in the open countryside to get a bit of exercise down a couple of dirt roads. When I did come back from my cycling ride, I parked my bike on the side of the cabin and looked over towards my wife's car. For some strange, unexplained reason, I decided to take a look at the car. I wanted to see whether that god-awful smell had finally dissipated. As I looked at her car, I noticed that there was a massive red, hairy thing lying on her back seat, and whatever it was monstrously huge. I had never seen anything so colossal before, but it was just like a huge wad of hair, and I was so intrigued as to what it actually was. I knew it could not be a bear, because the auburn hair was distinctly human-like in appearance. It was like soft and long. When I placed my ear against the back door of my wife's car, I heard these loud, human-like snores, only they were lower in their tone. I immediately went indoors to retrieve some binoculars, and I chose to hide behind the large oak tree, telling my wife that I would be taking a prolonged, brisk walk. I waited and waited for several hours behind that oak tree, and nothing happened, until the sun started to eventually go down. I watched the magnificent tangerine sunset covering the escarpment in its beautiful folds of orange, pinks, and golden hues, until finally it was replaced by the smouldering greys of the early evening. Luckily, all the outside lights on our cabin were on, so visibility was excellent. Suddenly I heard the rattling sound of my wife's car door opening very slowly, and then I saw this Herculean, like hairy humanoid ape, emerging from the car. That's the only way that I can describe him. He had a very distinct look of a silverback gorilla. The creature towered at about 7 feet tall, 500 pounds, and 4 feet in width. It was tall, lofty, majestic, and powerful looking, and was literally covered with soft flowing auburn hair from head to toe, and apart from the face, which appeared to be a pinky brown colour. I studied the creature through the binoculars, and it was light enough to take in the details of the face. It appeared that the creature had huge muscular shoulders, virtually no neck to speak of, and a very distinct bullet-shaped head. The face was long, and the pinkish skin appeared leathery, with a very distinct prominent brow ridge that was deeply furrowed with wrinkles, a flat nose, a thin mouth, and dark brown, rusty-coloured eyes. As the creature got out of the car, it raised its very extensive long arms to the sky, as if he was reaching for the clouds, and then he stretched, making a peculiar grunting sound. And then he reached to the ground and stretched again, and then he just literally sped away from the car at lightning speed, suddenly disappearing into the woods. His movements flowed seamlessly as he took huge 5 feet strides with his long, agile legs. He was magnificent to watch, even if I say so myself. I was so thrilled to have observed such an unusual creature, and I did not know what on earth it could be. I had never heard of such a creature existing before. There were no scientific books that described such a creature. If they did, I would know about it because I owned a bookstore. I never told my wife about him because I knew she wouldn't be happy that a monster-like creature was actually taking refuge in our car and under the cool shade of the oak tree. I kid you not, for many years I actually got to see this creature sleeping in my wife's car, not every day, but very regularly, and I never grew tired of watching and observing it. Sometimes I even left bags of apples, peaches and grapes and nuts in the car for it to be able to eat. So I believe my wife's car became a place of refuge for him, where he could indulge in a few special treats, and believe me, he ate everything I left him. My wife relentlessly complained about how smelly her car was, and actually wrote to the manufacturers of Mustang complaining about their seats, because she said that the fabric that they used to upholster the seats with appeared to harbour very unpleasant smells that could not be easily removed with lots of scrubbing. The manufacturer replied saying that to date they had not had any complaints from other customers concerning that issue, and that perhaps she should invest in a car deodorizer. As you can imagine, my wife was furious. When my wife traded in her old car for a Buick Reatta, the mysterious creature no longer came back to take refuge and sanctuary in the back of her car, much to my great disappointment. I guess he did not like the Buick, so all these years later she still believes that the upholstery in the Mustang car is substandard and absorbs nasty smells and odours. I have never had the heart to actually tell her the truth. It was only in 2008 that I came to realise that the mystery creature that I encountered frequently taking refuge in the back of my wife's car was in fact a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch or a Yeti, and I believe these creatures are remarkably clever. The creature almost always avoided my wife's car on a Thursday, when she did her morning shop. How did he know and discern that day? That I will never know. One thing I do know is that I did encounter a Bigfoot, and I do hope your listeners enjoyed the story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.